Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo. Lama da boo, lama da boo, lama da boo da boo.
Okay, chapter 5, letting go of truth. This was the chapter that really got me. I mean, I probably said that twice already in this book, but I feel like this is the one where something was really like, whoa, like something's being revealed to me. And so I'll read the epigraph first, the two statements in the epigraph. Again, this is chapter 5, letting go of truth, from After Buddhism. The first quote is from the Atthakavagga. I hope I pronounced that right. And it says, I do not say, quote, this is true, end quote, which is what fools say to each other. They make out their own way to be true. Therefore, they regard their opponent as a fool. And the second epigraph here is from the Dhatuvibhanga Sutra. And it says, his liberation, founded on truth, is unshakable. For this, bhikkhu, is the supreme noble truth, namely nirvana, which is undeceptive. And I want to read the first couple paragraphs here just to frame the conversation. It says, the Dharma may have started out as a twofold ground and a fourfold task, but Buddhism ended up with the two truths and the four noble truths. You will not find any references in authoritative sources on Buddhism to either a twofold ground or a fourfold task. These are examples of ideas that either failed to take off or were forgotten, suppressed, marginalized, or lost. Sometimes during the centuries after Gautama's death, Buddhism seems to have taken a metaphysical turn. By adopting a language of truth, Buddhists moved from an engaged agency with the world to the theorizing stance of a detached subject contemplating epistemic objects. Rather than consider injunctions to guide their ethical actions, they debated the truth of propositions in order to support their beliefs. They shifted seemingly en masse with little, if any, resistance from prescription to description, from pragmatism to ontology, from skepticism to dogmatism. How and why did this happen? I'm going to stop there. So I realized we were going to talk about some stuff at the top, but I think it's actually good that we started with the epigraph. So I'll frame like the kind of the introductory here as I think you and I both have been kind of meeting and having our own experiences with this idea of truth. And I think this chapter really gets at the idea of there being situations that we encounter and ways that we describe them, or states that we want to attain and ways that we try to attain those states. And I think it maybe to sum up this whole chapter in a way, or at least one of the themes, is that we often conflate those two. You know, we really kind of feel there's a strong connection between the actual situation and the way we describe it. And that occurred to me today when I was just kind of thinking about how Dharma is not a teaching method. Dharma, is not itself a teaching method, but the act of teaching Dharma inherently involves pedagogy. And I think a lot of times when we talk about the Dharma, we may be talking about how we teach it, or not recognizing that we're talking about a specific way of presenting it or teaching it, as opposed to the actual outcome we're trying to achieve. And so I think it's important that we don't confuse the teaching method with the Dharma, like how it's important to recognize the difference between a situation and statements we make about that situation. So, yeah, we'll start there.
Yeah, definitely agree. I feel like today, the title itself just kind of jumps out to me as being like the crucial message. I mean, I guess I think I missed some things initially with this chapter, perhaps. Lama, Adam, and I were talking before we started recording here, and I was kind of sharing with him, I guess, some of my personal process with this material. So just for the listeners' benefit, we'll let them in on the fact that, so we actually tried to record this episode last week, and we did record quite a bit. But I felt like I kind of just, it wasn't clicking for me. And I was getting hung up on some things in the chapter, and I didn't really feel like, I just didn't feel very articulate, I guess. And I wasn't quite in the right place with the material yet. And I guess like with Adam's help, I kind of realized that in fact I was getting triggered uh like on exactly the key crucial point of the chapter, which is essentially like not to get hung up on your own sense of the truth. And yeah, like I feel like maybe unnecessarily critical of the way he presented his points in here. But it's funny what just so I feel like my experience with this chapter at least was sort of like converging with a similar experience in different areas of my life. Like I was telling Adam before we started, like I think it kind of is actually all simple, and I'm having sometimes a hard time describing exactly the experience that I'm having, but I think it actually all just comes down to letting go a little bit more of like personal things that I'm clinging to frame my experience, something like that, like a need for just a simple need for a little more surrender. And it's funny because when you were just reading these quotes at the beginning, it's like I kind of realized sometimes you have to not take these Dharma statements so literally, but like read between the lines a little bit. Like, and it's important because like sometimes it's not, we don't always catch the way that we're getting hung up. You know what I mean? It's sometimes it's easy to miss. Like I would never have thought like that I was so obviously gonna in maybe various areas of life fall into the trap of like the first quote, for example, because it's like I don't think of myself as going around saying this is true. You know what I mean? But because I don't literally say that, but we actually do frequently say that with our being. It may be as simple as like certainty about what we should be doing. In some way, that is like a statement of like, this is true. Or it can be. It can be. Maybe it doesn't have to be, but it can be depending on how we go about it. And it's kind of like, it just, again, to me, brings up the need to, I don't know, like have a certain subtlety or like subtlety of discernment when it comes to Dharma. And also like, I guess it's just this point of like, the more we can approach it without clinging and with a sense of like just genuine openness, kind of like beginner's mind attitude, the better. Feel like maybe I'm just now starting,
It's definitely a process. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, it all resonates for me. This stuff sneaks up on you. I mean, if I could say one thing for the short time I've been on this path, like these teachings, I think always sneak up on me. Meaning, like, and when I say sneak up, I mean that even like in the sense of like when someone sneaks up on you, because when someone sneaks up on you, you're surprised, but there's also part of you that's like, I mean, maybe this, I'll use I statements again. Like, I also am a little annoyed that they would do that, like there's a moment of like, hey, because like all of a sudden I'm like shocked by this person sneaking up behind me. And I think I feel kind of similar to the Dharma sometimes when these teachings sneak up onto me. There's at least a similar reaction of like the initial reactivity of the situation is a little bit of like, I guess what we would call aggression, or like, dislike, because I'm unhappy that all of a sudden this teaching is sneaking up on me. And part of the unhappiness, just like when someone sneaks up on you, I think that that unhappiness maybe for me comes because like, I should have known, or why didn't I know that they were coming? I should have been more aware. And it's the same way with these teachings. It's like a lot of, like, usually the teaching that finally clicks is something I've heard 100 times and probably fast forwarded through some talk because I thought I already knew it, or something like that. So these truths that sneak up are often like there's that sense of not just surprise, but also like, why am I just getting that? Like why is this surprising me? Like I should already know this. This is a metaphor I've never made before, so I hope it makes sense. But I think it feels that way to me.
No, it does. Yeah, definitely. And it's also like one of those things where it's like our real hang-ups are like things that we genuinely don't see. So you can't see it until you see it. It's like the stuff you're noticing is not really the thing that you're totally unconscious of, obviously, because it's something that you started to notice. But with the things that we don't notice, it's like, there's no way to see it until you see it. And it could be a true blind spot. And I guess that kind of is just like speaks to the need to be patient with ourselves and keep going, like keep going with this stuff. And like nothing bad is ever going to happen from being humbled. I feel like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like when you're like, oh shit, I really wasn't seeing that. It's like, well, I mean, the only options are have more humility and openness, or like, I guess in an egoic way, like get frustrated about it and like, find something wrong with the teaching or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, this stuff I wrote down 2 words when you're speaking initially, and one of them was evocative and the other one was stream. And I wrote those down because like, I do feel like a lot of times these teachings are evocative. They evoke stuff from us. And I think a lot of times they're designed to evoke something, and I think part of that evocation, is that a word? I hope so. It seems like it would be.
Yeah, I believe so.
So part of that evocation is because of the stasis of not knowing or not recognizing the very things you're talking about. There's like this sort of stasis or I mean, it's definitely ignorance, but there's like a sense of non-motion happening, and we need to evoke things into action. And then that action is this kind of stream that we've talked about already in this book, which is in one way going with the flow of the Eightfold Path. But the way that feels to us, I think, it is like it work, like effort. We're actually going against a stream of our reactivity. Then that feels like work. So like we need to be evoked into acting, and then that acting is not just lazily floating down with the flow of our reactivity. It's moving against it. So we have to kind of wake up and get to work, and that, when I have to wake up and get to work, it's not usually, my reaction is not usually like, yay. It's like, man, I wish I could stay in bed for a while. I wish this was a day off. And so,
okay, so here's another thing I'm just thinking is like, I think maybe lately I've been just making a little too much conflict for myself, like creating a subtle, unnecessary conflict with my own experience, like just simply, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know how to, it's not like you were kind of saying earlier, maybe it's in a way like a stress response. I feel like it's a little under the surface, like not super articulated even internally, but like just a way in which and I'm sure all of us experience this some, it's like there is sometimes a way that we like have this subtle problem with things. Like it's not super clear. It's like we, divide ourselves and kind of have an unnecessary friction from what's with what's going on. And I feel like it's, I mean, very much existentially related to this material. Like it's kind of exactly what he's talking about. And another way that relates to this chapter, like when I'm coming to it today, I'm like, man, a lot of these takeaways are actually really simple, despite the fact that this is a very complicated chapter.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, when we get into it, like, I mean, it's hard to understand everything he's talking about. And sometimes, at least when I was going through it before, it's like you almost kind of like lose the thread of the point, but actually the takeaways are pretty simple. A lot of it is right here on the first page, and an important point to make with this chapter, which I think is related to what I'm saying, is we can't forget the fundamental need for practice, like the practical value. You know what I mean? Like we're definitely going to get into some pretty rigorous philosophical stuff in here, but at the end of the day, we need to like focus on the practical application, which could actually be pretty simple.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think two things came to mind when you're talking about that friction with experience. There was the same book that I mentioned to Mitchell earlier before we started the recording. I'm working through a book called Widen the Window by an author named Elizabeth Stanley, who developed a program called MFIT. That is, I'm not exactly sure what the acronym is. I think it's something like Mind Fitness Training or something. And it's like a mindfulness-based program that they're using in the military and I think some other settings to kind of prepare people for stress via mindful techniques. And I'm not all the way through the book, and I'm in no way an expert in this, but what popped into my mind as she was talking about how she developed the program with the warrior traditions in mind. And she kind of pointed out that she used two terms that I think we would use something different for at least one of those. But she said they both include an emphasis on wisdom and courage. And I think we might say wisdom and compassion. And I think these line up if we say that. But she said courage. We, in a particularly Buddhist context, would probably say compassion. But the way she described those two things, where wisdom is being able to clearly see a situation as it is and make decisions based on what's actually happening. That's like the wisdom aspect. And the courage aspect that she describes, that I think we could just as easily call compassion, is being able to accept a situation as it is without needing it to be different.
Interesting.
So there's sort of a knowing and then like an act, like a response, I think is what we would maybe call the second. Like, so we respond, I guess, with like the knowledge aspect, or the panoramic view kind of wisdom. And then the accepting is like the action, in that moment, like not the specific action, but it's I guess our attitude, like maybe like the flavor of the knowing then becomes this flavor of acceptance. And then we make a choice based on how things really are without feeling like we need the situation to be different than it actually is. And I guess saying that out loud, I would also just kind of follow that up by saying, like, I don't think the idea is to never try to change a bad situation into something better. I think that it's the idea of like, the situation as it is needs to be dealt with. And you can always try to make things better, but you have to first accept that the situation is what it is and then make action, take action based on that. And I think oftentimes those are the two places where and again, this is like, there's a zillion words written about wisdom and compassion and all kinds of elaborate tantric practices to recognize this and stuff. But I think we can draw a line right back to this idea of like, feeling that resistance to how things are, Yeah.
And I like that because it also makes me think the idea of compassion specifically can be something that is very, in our minds, perhaps very like elevated and hard to approach. And I think there's a lot of teachings that do kind of speak against that. But actually, I think in my experience, uh, more there are more teachings that kind of confirm that idea of it, which I think is, really a big obstacle. And I know that I've come across the notion in Dharma teachings that actually uh, describe compassion a little bit more the way you're talking about. Like it's almost more of it's a very at home response. Like, and it's not necessarily something that's real extravagant or exaggerated or even maybe not even noticeable to outside observers. It's just like a sort of existential stance of like acceptance, like you're saying. But it reminded me of, there's like that notion that the most immediate or the most direct way to free all sentient beings is by simply like freeing them from our projection. You know what I mean? Like, it's like we basically free them from our side,
Wow. Yeah.
It's not that we don't have to go out and it doesn't necessarily mean going out and like literally saving everybody, but it's like letting them be free as they are.
That's
maybe
big.
It's our, yeah.
Yeah, I like that idea. It's like we're burdening people with our shit. Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Huh. Ah, that's big, man. Thank you. Huh. Yeah, I think we should probably dive into this material specifically, but this is a great intro, and I think the only other thing I want to mention, because we talked about this a little earlier too, is that I think that this material probably resonates with, or could resonate with people from any tradition, because like one thing that Mitchell and I were talking about earlier is I realized, like, is this situation with like Gautama teaching and then that becoming Buddhism a religion, is that the same thing as like Christ teaching and becoming Christianity? And I think we both kind of feel like there's probably a lot of parallels there, like an individual teaching a basic method of like well-being and communal living that's helpful to individuals and communities, that then becomes all of the stuff about that, all of the truths, So I think there's probably a lot of overlap with this in any religion. And I think it probably does come back to this idea of truth, like letting go of like what we have to say about the situation and actually connecting with it directly.
Definitely.
So we start out here with kind of a journey from what were the pragmatic 4 tasks to the metaphysical truths. And to finish the paragraph, I stopped on, he says, how and why did this happen? Possibly the tension between tasks and truths began to make itself felt within the community during the Buddha's lifetime. The 2 canonical passages cited in the epigraphs, for example, illustrate opposing attitudes to the notion of truth. While the first text from the chapter of Eights maintains that anyone who claims this is true is a fool, the second from the exposition of elements declares nirvana to be the supreme noble truth. Which of these are we to take seriously? Since the chapter of Eights is widely accepted as one of the oldest texts in Pali, I will assume that it represents an earlier perspective. Yet from there, we move to a discourse bearing the title of Vibhanga, which means exposition or commentary, that replaces the skeptical, ironic tone of the chapter of Eights with the assured certainty of the believer. And we see this change, I think, carried out through the example of when the Buddha returned to Deer Park, where he originally taught the 4 tasks. And he tells everyone that Sariputra is able to expound on and demonstrate the 4 noble truths. And he explains, so Sariputra, the Buddha kind of leaves and Sariputra starts to explain, and he explains each of the truths, but he stops abruptly, Batchelor says, before giving any of the tasks related to each truth. And what was like dukkha is to be comprehended just becomes the truth of dukkha. And reactivity is to be let go of becomes the noble truth of the cause of suffering. And so we see this kind of abrupt stop of what was like a pragmatic, task-oriented teaching starting to become just like a truth that we're supposed to learn. And it's funny because I think it is really hard to understand. Wow, okay, here's something I never thought about. There's a number of different stories, I think, and it's probably from the different canons. And I know part of what he does here is examine the different canons. But like I know one thing he says in here is that after the exposition of the 4 tasks, initially the first one, that one of the listeners became enlightened. But I think you've probably heard, because it's probably from our tradition, that all 5 of them attained enlightenment at the end of the 4 tasks when he first read those. Mm-hmm. And so in either case, I always found it a little confusing how I mean, I guess I can see that there's if we talk about like they had the karma and these previous lifetimes of practice, how does just telling some people the truths as we normally get them make them enlightened? But then I understood better when I heard the 3 repetitions, that supposedly the 4 tasks were taught 3 times. The first time they were just like listed. The second time the tasks were given, comprehend suffering, let go of reactivity. And the third time there was even more specificity, like other than dukkha, there's nothing to be comprehended. Other than reactivity or grasping or clinging, the cause of suffering, other than the cause of suffering, there's nothing to be let go of. So I think it makes a little more sense. But if we think of it just as the truth of suffering, the truth of the cause of suffering, like it is surprising to think that like 5 individuals would all of a sudden become enlightened without the tasks included, or any individuals to be honest. Like it doesn't, when it's presented as a list of truths, it's not, the practice isn't given, I would say. The practice is not inherent in the list of the 4 noble truths we often see on the walls of temples. Like there needs to be exposition of that to explain what to do with that information,
Yeah, true.
Next note I have is he said it took 400 years for the Pali Canon to be considered closed. And he also highlights how in this time, this is when Brahmanism was sweeping what he calls the social, religious, and metaphysical life of the area Gautama once lived and taught. This is probably when the teachings went from pragmatic philosophy to become an Indian religion, because in the context of that time, proponents of the Dharma had to argue the truth of their views because that was the framework that Brahmanism was working in, like this idea of truths. And so then Buddhism had to kind of adapt and became about this idea of like proving, actually, like this is interesting, they started to have to prove the Dharma through words rather than practice. It became marketing. I haven't thought of it this way before, but it's like, how can you prove whether your religion is true or not religion? How can you prove that your method works without doing it? And even the Buddha said that. Don't believe it just because I'm saying it. You have to test it yourself. We always hear that story about testing the Dharma like it's gold. But here's an environment where all of a sudden, in order for these teachings to survive, they had to evolve a way to express and hopefully make the words show the truth of the practice without the practice. That's tough.
Yeah, that is tough. I feel like Buddhism generally deals quite a bit in what is ineffable, like in terms of the realization that we're basically trying to cultivate. So probably tricky to put that into words, provable words.
Yeah. All right. Well, jumping on to part 2, I feel like this section is really digging into the ethical truth versus metaphysical truth. And we talk a lot about the word sakka, which is predominantly predominantly means truthful, honest, loyal, and sincere. And it's an ethical practice rather than a metaphysical claim. Sakka is. an ethical practice rather than a metaphysical claim. It's something to do, not something to believe in, let alone to be enlightened about. And he says, translators today, however, translate Saka in these contexts as truthfulness rather than truth. While this choice fits with the general usage of the term truth in Orthodox Buddhism, it unwittingly exposes how a word that began by denoting the virtue of honesty came to denote something like reality. We can see how this could happen. A true statement is an accurate representation in words of what is the case in reality, of facts. Over time, it seems that truth started being used for the facts themselves, as well as for correct statements about those facts. A statement is true because it corresponds with the truth, and the person who makes such utterances is said to be truthful. And then he introduces this idea of like a correspondence theory of truth, which soon became taken for granted in Buddhist philosophical thought, even though he points out that a lot of Western philosophers have pointed out that this idea of truth then becomes like the end of a path rather than like the beginning of a process of self-examination. Like if we say we found a truth, then we think we're done. And there's no encouragement to like keep moving or keep questioning or keep doubting. And I'll include another quote here from this is Gianni Vattimo, says, "We don't reach agreement when we have discovered the truth," he observes. "We say we have discovered the truth when we reach agreement." Vattimo elegantly rejects the metaphysics of truth in favor of an ethics of truth, thereby recovering truth as a virtue of spoken language and human interactions. As long as we insist on the default assumption that I am right and you are wrong, we will be unable to relate to one another without complete empathy, generosity. We will be unable to relate to one another with complete empathy, generosity, honesty, and tolerance. It is in this sense, concludes Vattimo, that when the word truth is uttered, a shadow of violence is cast as well.
Yeah, I marked that quote as well. My main takeaway from this section, like I think kind of the most relatable, eye-opening point is just that whole idea of like truthfulness as kind of a manner of being, rather than like a conclusion, so to speak. I'm glad that kind of came back up because it reminded me of something I was going to say about the Four Noble, like the way that the four tasks sort of transformed into the Four Noble Truths. There's a thread there in both cases, which I think is the move away from like process-oriented language to like conclusive, stagnant language, or like the establishment of like stagnant principles, I guess. I know we probably touched on that, or we've touched on that before in this book, maybe already, but that just sticks out to me, like the idea of truthfulness, the development of truthfulness as like a mode of being is like a process-oriented thing, and same with the tasks. It's like it speaks to how we might move through the process of life, as opposed to just like it says here, sort of latching on to like set ideas.
Like I feel like part of reading between the lines of what he's saying here, I think like he's trying to keep us moving. Like I think he's trying to not let, and this whole book is kind of a process of like, let's keep moving, let's keep people active in the Dharma, actively practicing the Dharma. And I think there has to be an understanding in the pedagogy of this, that there may have been a reason for some of these shifts towards metaphysical truths, and they could very well be the reason the Dharma is even here today. Like it could very well be like these exact things that were how this survived to make it here to us today. So I can't in any way say like this shouldn't have happened or this is a bad thing inherently. But I think part of staying in motion, staying active and practicing is to look at the effects of these things we're saying and things that have been said for a long time and see what the effects are now. Thinking about causes and conditions, like, is talking about a truth bringing about the ends that we want it to, or is there maybe a better way to talk about this? And the reason I say this is because we're in a very different society right now. We're in a very different culture. And when I say we, I mean, I can really only talk about, like, honestly, like Ohio, but also Mississippi to a larger extent, and America and Western culture. But there are all these different sort of containers in which we're putting Dharma now. And I think a lot of what he gets at when he's refuting things, or seems to be refuting things in this book, I think, like me, he's probably seen a lot of people fall into the pitfalls on this path. And I think one of the biggest pitfalls is certainty. I think one of the biggest pitfalls is feeling like you've got it figured out and I've got the answer. And I think that there may have been a time where that's exactly what was needed, or there may have been a time, or there may be a time, or a culture, or a place where that's exactly what people need to keep them on the path that's effective, the path of Dharma. But I think in our culture, especially right now, I mean, certainty and knowing the truth and feeling like you've got it figured out is how QAnon works. It's how politics and division is sown in this country. It is maybe the prime driver for all of the conflicts in our world today. So I think we really need to think seriously about the effect of basing all of this, on truths or metaphysical truths, as opposed to what I think he's proposing, which is just a shift back towards a little more uncertainty, a little sense of uncertainty that keeps us moving, as opposed to a sense of certainty that can trap us.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. I mean, I think like that idea of like inspiring us to be engaged and keep moving, like you said, with the Dharma. I mean, that's a really great point. And again, illuminates the whole, like, if we just accept the truth of something, that is the pathway to complacency, really. Like once you've gotten it, so to speak, or once you've concluded about what is true, you don't really have to, like you're saying, you don't have to think about it anymore. You don't have to be engaged in the same way because you've reached conclusions. And like it just occurred to me, like, even if certain teaching triggers us, like we have the response of like disagreeing, right? Or like not liking it. That is actually even better, right? Than like just accepting it and not the acceptance of truth could just, I feel like, so easily be a way to remain in ignorance. Honestly, I mean,
almost like a force field. Like I can remain here because I have the truth.
Right. And I mean, it is potentially, I mean, who can say for sure about anything, but it's potentially, I could see like an existential stance or an existential mode of being that is pretty out of line with what we observe, which is constant flux and process and change. And it's really hard to reach any kind of set conclusion about anything, honestly, like once and for all, you know what I mean? Like everything kind of is in process.
Well, and I think this book is primarily related with the Theravada tradition. But if we extend this out into like Mahayana and particularly like Madhyamaka, like that whole point of that philosophy is you can never find a final answer to anything, so we are kind of moving in some ways, moving in that direction of that. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I have more to say about that, but I think it's interesting that like that is where we're going with some of these teachings, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, I personally found ways in my sort of thinking about this chapter and kind of like at least beginning the process of removing a kind of boundary that I just started to perceive with myself. I felt like it was completely applicable to like the Vajrayana style stuff too. Like it was almost like it showed me the ways in which that stuff was also a boundary, but it's not a boundary in the sense of like it's blocking you from anything. It's that you're blocking yourself. I'm talking about me, obviously. I'm saying you, but it's like I'm blocking myself from actually connecting with this style of teaching fully. You know what I mean? Because it goes back to the basics. It goes back to the basic stuff, like the stuff he's saying in here, like the engagement with sensory perception. Even if we just use that as the example, right? The relationship to what we perceive through the five senses. I mean, that is living our lives with awareness of that is the really like the heart of Vajrayana Buddhism. I mean, it's not the formal teaching, but it is the unhinged, informal result is the freedom to live your life, a life of the five senses imbued with wisdom and compassion, you know? And that's actually like right here, right now. It's not actually, it's not some sort of like imaginary thing. It's so easy to think it's like an imaginary thing that we're talking about, but it's actually this, which is the same thing he's saying, you know?
Yeah. And I guess maybe that's another place where there's like a pitfall or a potential risk is that like our experience, like when we actually experience what the Dharma is supposed to bring about, that can then seem to run contrary to what we've told our truths or the way things are supposed to be by a certain teaching. Yeah. You know, and like that's dangerous because like that can actually be beholding the ceasing of suffering. You know, like for instance, like I think he said in a previous chapter, we can behold suffering in a moment of, or I'm sorry, behold nirvana in a moment of anger. You know, we can see our anger rise up, and in that moment, let go of it. You know what I mean? And actually, for a moment, behold suffering. But like I said it again, behold nirvana. You know, behold the ceasing of suffering. But yeah, like I think that. Yeah, I mean, our own personal experiences, number one, are very hyper specific to us. But I think they can also look in the moment or feel in the moment very different than a collection of words fashioned into a truth claim.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then it's almost like we could find ourselves like throwing away the sort of richness of some actual insight into the Dharma and choosing to instead adhere to concepts.
Yeah.
You know, like it's very, very possible. Like, I guess what I'm thinking of when I say that is like the way in which sometimes I don't think it's necessarily intentional or something. I'm not trying to make it sound like there's like a conspiracy, but the way that we are sometimes encouraged to maybe dismiss the development of our own experience, moments of realization as not it, and instead turn toward it, which is just like the teachings, which is just concepts, right? To get us to those moments that we've kind of like looked away from because we think, well, this is just my life. This isn't really it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that also brings up the idea of like trusting the inner Buddha, trusting innate wisdom and compassion. I think for a while there, I kind of thought like, well, that's for later. Like, I think that I feel like in the teachings, it's always about balancing those two. But I think regardless, I'm not saying anybody taught anything they shouldn't have taught me, but I will say that I think what I heard is right now you need to trust the teachings until you've developed enough to trust yourself. Like, I think I heard some version of that, or at least like that I need to put more emphasis on trusting the teachings or the teachers and less on my own experience and my own wisdom. And I think looking back, I would have really tried to balance those two better. And I think that may be the number one mistake I've consistently made on the path up to now, is not trusting enough my own experience, because that is, the ground, and I need that. And so I think that, I would mention that, because I think that it's probably a common thing in the beginning to think like, all right, well, I've been, for this whole lifetime at a minimum, but potentially a whole bunch of other lifetimes, creating a ton of suffering. So I need to put most of my trust in this set of teachings and teachers and whatnot, so that they can start to pull me out. But I think looking back, I would posit that I think you really can balance those two, and need to balance those two right from the beginning, or this doesn't work. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Although that is a good point that you bring up. I will say that, like, that might be a relevant practical takeaway with some of this. Like, I just mean, like, remembering that there may be a time, like, I would say for me, there was a time when I did need something to sort of put some certainty and trust in that was seemingly not me. You know what I mean? But I also agree that balancing the two from the beginning would be wise. I don't know, like, and I kind of think it's okay that there's just like a little bit of a mixed message in there. That's like part of it. You know what I mean? Because there's no, like, it is a process that we're talking about here. And I'm not sure if there's a way for it to be like, I'm not even sure if the notion of like, I don't think it can be perfect exactly, because we're kind of working through our own confusion and hangups. So everybody's going to be a little different. And that's okay. Like, we're going to get bits and pieces. It's good that we're saying what we're saying. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, trust yourself from the beginning. Also, sometimes maybe you need to place trust in something somebody else is saying at a given moment. Like, and it's okay that they're both there, because we just have to go moment by moment. They both could be true at different times,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's also the case that like they're true at the same time. And I think you're kind of saying that too, but I mean, it's that kind of thing where it's like, from a relative standpoint, it seems like we need one or the other, but we could potentially say from an ultimate standpoint that we need both all the time. But in any given moment, we should know, develop our discernment to know which one should be prioritized in the moment. And I think maybe one guideline on that is like, if we can develop the ability to be aware of when we're reacting, with attachment or clinging, or, actually, like I would say, like when we're reacting with the effluences, the word he uses in here, for anger, desire, and ignorance. Like, if we can notice like, oh, this is what's motivating me right now, then maybe that's a good time to put more faith into like something we read or something a teacher said. But if we can see in that moment that we're letting go of those things, then our experience becomes what we can trust. But that's probably a lot easier said than done.
Yeah. I'm just like, speaking from my experience, I would say maybe one thing to look for in that particular moment of transition would be like a little bit of a conscious feeling of fear or hesitation, because I mean, just from my experience, like having spent a long time relying with some certainty on the teachings and like in a more formal sense, like the process of starting to trust your own experience more can feel a little like scary. Like, I mean, not like a horror movie exactly, but like it's like, or maybe another way of talking about it is like we've talked about this through the podcast a lot, but like just the process of gaining some kind of confidence in the faith, uncertainty, hesitation, doubt. But like it's just another way to remember that experience of uncertainty and doubt is potentially a very powerful and ultimately good thing. It might be kind of like the transition of power, so to speak, potentially.
Yeah, great point. Okay, so I think we should wrap up this episode and cover the rest in a second episode, because this is a rich chapter, and I'm really appreciating the conversation today. So we'll conclude this episode, and we'll see you next week with the second part of Chapter 5 after Buddhism. Take care.
Sounds good.